February 14, 1945, the coldest winter on record in the Austrian Alps. While couples across America celebrated Valentine's Day with chocolates and flowers, a military transport truck struggled through mountain passes where temperatures had plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Inside the canvas-covered vehicle, 32 German women prisoners huddled together for warmth, their breath forming clouds of ice crystals in the frigid air. These weren't hardened soldiers or Nazi officials. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the Allied advance through Austria, now being transported to a prisoner of war facility near Innsbruck. But the brutal winter had other plans. Corporal Vincent Hayes from Vermont, one of 4 American guards assigned to the convoy, had seen plenty of New England winters, but nothing had prepared him for this. The wind screamed through the mountain passes with a fury that seemed almost alive, driving snow so thick he couldn't see 3 feet beyond the truck's hood. The roads, already treacherous in good weather, had become death traps of ice and hidden crevasses. Before we discover what happened to these women and their captors, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The lead vehicle had already slid off the road twice. Now, as darkness fell with the suddenness that only mountain country knows, Corporal Hayes made a decision that would save lives but strand them all in the wilderness. He ordered the convoy to stop. They couldn't risk driving blind into ravines they'd never see coming. The women prisoners, already suffering from inadequate winter clothing, began showing signs of hypothermia. Their gray auxiliary uniforms, designed for administrative work in heated offices, offered little protection against the killing cold. Among them was 24-year-old Frieda Keller, a former radio operator from Munich. She watched as her friend Anna Weber began to shake, uncontrollably, her lips turning blue despite being wrapped in every spare blanket they could find. Sergeant Marcus Bennett, the ranking American officer, gathered his men for a quick assessment. Private Leonard Price and Private Eugene Miller stood beside him, their faces already showing the early stages of frostbite. They had limited fuel, no working radio communication, and no clear idea where they were on the mountain. The nearest town was at least 15 miles away, assuming they could even find it in the blizzard. Staying in the vehicles meant slowly freezing to death. Moving meant risking death even faster in the storm. The prisoners watched this discussion with growing fear. They understood enough English to grasp the severity of their situation. Some began to pray quietly in German. Others simply stared into the darkness beyond the truck, where the wind howled like something out of ancient mythology. Then, through the screaming wind, Corporal Hayes saw something that made him question his frozen senses. Lights. Small, flickering points of orange warmth, moving through the storm. They weren't stars, weren't reflections. They were lanterns, carried by figures approaching through the snow. Mountain men, moving with the confident stride of those who knew this terrain as intimately as their own heartbeats. The figures emerged from the blizzard like ghosts materializing from another world. 4 men, their faces weathered by decades of mountain winters, wrapped in thick wool coats and fur-lined boots that spoke of generations of alpine survival. The lead man, Josef Steiner, raised his lantern higher as he approached the stranded convoy. He was perhaps 60 years old, with a gray beard crusted with ice, and eyes that had seen empires rise and fall in these mountains. Sergeant Bennett instinctively reached for his rifle, then stopped himself. These men carried no weapons beyond the hunting knives at their belts and the walking sticks that helped them navigate the treacherous snow. More importantly, they were their only hope of survival. Josef spoke first, his German accented with the distinctive lilt of the Tyrolean mountains. "American soldiers?" he asked, then switching to heavily accented English. "You are lost. This storm, it kills. You must come with us now." Behind Josef stood 3 other men. Franz Adler, a younger hunter with sharp features and suspicious eyes, held his lantern close, examining the convoy with obvious distrust. Wilhelm Koch, a trapper whose weathered hands spoke of a life spent in harsh conditions, stood silently observing. Georg Mayer, the youngest of the group at perhaps 35, shifted his weight nervously, clearly uncertain about what they were about to do. Corporal Hayes stepped forward, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "We have prisoners, German women, 32 of them. Can you help us?" The question hung in the frozen air like a physical thing. These Austrian mountain men had lived through 6 years of German occupation. Their villages had been commandeered, their young men conscripted into Hitler's armies, their resources stolen to feed the Nazi war machine. The women in these trucks wore the uniforms of that regime, however auxiliary their service had been. Franz spoke sharply in German to Joseph, his voice carrying anger even through the storm. Wilhelm placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of harder wisdom. Georg remained silent, but his eyes moved from the American soldiers to the truck where the women prisoners huddled, visible through gaps in the canvas covering. Joseph turned back to Sergeant Bennett, his face unreadable in the lantern light. "My village, 3 kilometers north. We have cabins in the high country. Hidden places where hunters stay during long expeditions. Empty now because of this storm." He paused, and in that pause, decades of history seemed to weigh upon his shoulders. "We take you there. All of you. But we must go now. In 1 hour, maybe less, this storm becomes worse. Then no one survives." Inside the truck, Frida had been watching this exchange through a gap in the canvas. She understood the mountain dialect well enough to catch fragments of the conversation. She turned to Anna, whose shivering had become more violent. "Austrian villagers," she whispered. "They're deciding whether to save us or leave us to freeze." The irony wasn't lost on either woman. They had served a regime that had brutalized these people's homeland, and now their lives depended on whether these mountain men could find mercy for their enemies. The decision made, Joseph barked orders in rapid German to his companions. Franz and Wilhelm moved to the lead truck, while Georg helped the Americans assess which vehicles might still be operational. The wind had grown even more savage, if such a thing were possible, and Joseph's warning about the worsening storm proved prophetic. The temperature continued its deadly plunge. Sergeant Bennett made the difficult call. They would have to abandon the trucks and travel on foot. The vehicles couldn't navigate the narrow mountain paths Joseph described, paths that only locals knew existed. The women prisoners would need to walk 3 kilometers through waist-deep snow in 40-degree below zero temperatures with inadequate clothing. Some might not survive the journey, but staying guaranteed death for all of them. Corporal Hayes moved to the back of the transport truck and pulled aside the canvas. 32 pairs of eyes stared back at him, fear and cold having stripped away any pretense of military bearing. "Listen carefully," he said, speaking slowly so those with limited English could follow. "We're abandoning the vehicles. Local men are taking us to shelter, but it's a hard walk through deep snow. Stay together. Help each other. If you fall behind, you die. Understand?" Frida translated rapidly into German for those who hadn't grasped the English. The women began to move, their frozen limbs protesting every motion. Anna could barely stand, and Frida wrapped an arm around her friend's waist, determined not to let her fall. Liesel Schmidt, a former nurse from Berlin, began organizing the stronger women to assist the weaker ones. Ingrid Brenner and Helena Vogel, both young women barely out of their teens, clung to each other for warmth and courage. Joseph watched this organization with an expression that might have been approval. He spoke to Franz in their dialect, and the younger man, despite his obvious reluctance, began distributing extra wool blankets from the packs the mountain men carried. These were precious supplies, meant for emergencies in their own community, now being given to enemy women. Wilhelm showed Private Price how to wrap cloth around exposed skin to prevent frostbite, demonstrating with efficient movements born of lifelong experience. The procession began its desperate march into the darkness. Joseph led, his lantern, cutting a small circle of light through the blinding snow. The women followed in a ragged line, supporting each other, stumbling through drifts that sometimes rose above their waists. The American guards spread throughout the column, trying to keep everyone together. Georg brought up the rear, his own lantern ensuring no one fell behind into the killing darkness. The cold was beyond anything Frida had imagined possible. Each breath felt like inhaling knives. Her feet had gone numb within the first 10 minutes, and she knew that frostbite was already setting in. Anna leaned heavily against her, barely conscious, her weight growing heavier with each step. Around them, other women struggled with their own battles against the elements. Someone behind them began to cry, the sound quickly swallowed by the wind. Franz moved through the column with Wilhelm, checking on the stragglers. When he reached a young woman who had collapsed into the snow, he hesitated only a moment before lifting her onto his shoulders. His face remained hard, unreadable, but his actions spoke louder than any words. Wilhelm did the same for another woman, who could no longer walk. These mountain men, who had every reason to hate everything these uniforms represented, were saving lives with their own strength. After what felt like an eternity of frozen hell, Josef's lantern illuminated the dark shape of a building emerging from the storm. Not one cabin, but 3, built into a natural shelter formed by the mountain itself. These were hunting lodges, constructed generations ago by men who understood how to survive in conditions that would kill the unprepared. Thick stone walls, reinforced wooden doors, and shuttered windows designed to withstand the worst the Alps could deliver. Josef pushed open the door of the largest cabin, and the group stumbled inside, collapsing onto the wooden floor in various states of exhaustion and hypothermia. The interior was simple but functional. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, with stacks of dried wood stored nearby. Rough-hewn benches and tables filled the space, and sleeping platforms lined the walls. It smelled of old smoke, pine, and the particular mustiness of a place left empty through a long winter. Within minutes, Wilhelm had a fire blazing in the hearth, the flames growing from small flickers to roaring life. The immediate warmth felt almost painful against frozen skin. Georg and Franz opened the other 2 cabins, finding them similarly equipped. They would split the group, with women in the main cabin, American guards in the second, and the mountain men in the third. But first, everyone needed to warm themselves and assess the damage the cold had inflicted. Liesel, the nurse, moved immediately into action despite her own exhaustion. She began examining the women for frostbite, her trained eyes assessing blue fingertips and pale patches on exposed skin. Anna's condition worried her most. The young woman's core temperature had dropped dangerously low during the march. Liesel barked orders in German, calling for blankets, for warm water, not hot, for someone to keep Anna awake and talking. Private Eugene Miller, who had served as a medic before being assigned to guard duty, approached hesitantly. "I have medical training," he offered. "May I help?" Liesel looked at him with surprise, then nodded curtly. Language barriers fell away as medical necessity created its own vocabulary. Miller showed her the supplies in his field kit, meager but potentially life-saving. Together they worked on Anna, their cooperation wordless but effective. Josef returned from the storage cellar beneath the cabin carrying preserved food, smoked meats, dried vegetables, jars of pickled goods, and hard bread that would soften in hot water. It was survival food, meant to sustain hunters through extended stays in the mountains. Now it would feed 32 German prisoners, 4 American soldiers, and 4 Austrian mountain men trapped together by circumstances none of them could have imagined. Rosa Steiner, Josef's wife, had insisted he pack extra supplies before he left that morning. She had a gift for knowing when preparations would be needed. Now, as Josef laid out the food, he thought of her wisdom. There was enough here to keep them all alive for several days if necessary. The question wasn't whether they could survive, but how they would coexist in such close quarters while the storm raged outside. Frida found herself sitting near the fire, finally able to feel her fingers again. Across from her sat Georg, the youngest of the mountain men. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, she saw something unexpected. Not hatred, not disgust, but a kind of weary recognition. They were both young people caught in a war neither had started, now sharing warmth and shelter because the alternative was death. The meal was distributed in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, not hostile, but contemplative. As the warmth of food and fire slowly revived frozen bodies, something else began to thaw as well. The blizzard continued its assault through the night, wind howling around the cabins like a living thing determined to break through the walls. Inside, the warmth from the fire had restored circulation and life to frozen limbs, but it had also restored the capacity for thought, for memory, for the weight of history that pressed down on everyone in that room. Franz Adler sat apart from the others, his back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the German women with an expression that alternated between fury and something harder to define. Finally, he could no longer contain what burned inside him. He spoke in German, his voice low but carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "Do you know what your soldiers did to my village?" The room fell silent. Even those who didn't speak German understood that something significant was being said. Josef placed a hand on Franz's shoulder, but the younger man shook it off. He stood, his weathered face illuminated by firelight, years of suppressed anger finally finding voice. 3 years ago, Franz continued, German officers came to our village. They needed supplies for the Eastern Front. They took everything. Our food stores, our livestock, even the seed grain we needed for spring planting. When my father protested, when he explained that we would starve without those supplies, they shot him in the village square as an example. Frida felt her stomach turn. She had filed requisition reports, had processed paperwork for supply transfers. Had her efficient work contributed to scenes like the one Franz described? Anna, still weak but conscious now, began to cry silently. Other women stared at the floor, unable to meet the mountain man's eyes. Wilhelm spoke next, his voice quieter but no less painful. My son was conscripted 2 years ago, 17 years old. They sent him to Stalingrad. We received notice of his death 6 months later. He froze to death in a Russian winter, fighting a war he didn't believe in, for a cause he didn't understand. Georg added his own story, speaking directly to the women. My sister, they took her to work in a munitions factory in Munich. We heard she died when the factory was bombed by American planes. She was 16. The testimonies continued, each mountain man sharing losses that the war had inflicted on their small communities. Villages stripped of young men, families destroyed, homes commandeered, dignity stripped away by occupiers who spoke of German superiority while treating Austrians as convenient resources for the Reich's ambitions. Sergeant Bennett watched this unfold, understanding enough German to follow the conversation. He saw the women's faces crumble, saw tears flow freely now. These weren't the tears of self-pity, but of recognition, of confronting complicity they had never fully acknowledged. Liesel finally spoke, her voice breaking. We didn't know. We told ourselves we were just doing our jobs, just following orders, just supporting our country's defense. But we didn't ask questions. We didn't want to see. She looked at Franz directly. That doesn't excuse anything. But it's the truth. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, the only sound besides the relentless wind outside. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the blizzard had intensified, transforming the world outside the cabins into a white void where earth and sky became indistinguishable. Josef stood at the window, his expression grave as he studied the conditions. He had lived in these mountains for 60 years and had never seen a storm of this magnitude. The snow had risen past the window frames, and the wind carried a sound that experienced mountain men recognized with dread. The avalanche hit without warning at mid-morning. A deep rumbling that started far up the mountain, growing louder as thousands of tons of snow and ice broke loose and cascaded down the slope. The cabin shook violently, timbers groaning under the impact. Women screamed as the world seemed to tilt. Corporal Hayes grabbed onto a support beam as jars crashed from shelves and the fire scattered embers across the stone hearth. When the rumbling finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the cabin. Josef was already moving toward the door, but when he tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. They were buried. The avalanche had swept over their position, entombing all 3 cabins under tons of packed snow. Wilhelm used his knife to pry open a shutter, revealing nothing but a solid wall of white where the forest had been visible before. We must dig, Josef said calmly, though everyone could hear the tension beneath his words. If we don't create air passages, we suffocate. If we don't reach the other cabins, the men there suffocate. He looked around at the mixed group of Americans and Germans. Everyone who can work, works. This is not about nations now. This is about survival. The reality of their situation stripped away the last remnants of hostility. Georg organized teams with the efficiency of someone who had faced mountain emergencies before. The strongest would dig, rotating frequently to prevent exhaustion. Others would maintain the fire, prepare food, and melt snow for water. Everyone had a role. Everyone contributed. Frida found herself working beside Franz, both of them using tools from the cabin's storage to chip away at the packed snow blocking the door. The work was exhausting, the progress painfully slow. Franz glanced at her several times, his earlier anger now tempered by the shared urgency of their situation. "You know how to work," he said finally, almost grudgingly. "Not like a soldier. Like someone from the mountains." "My grandfather was a woodsman in Bavaria," Frida replied, pausing to catch her breath. "He taught me that survival requires everyone's effort." She looked at Franz, directly. "I cannot undo what my country did to yours, but I can work beside you now to keep us all alive." After hours of exhausting labor, they finally broke through to the second cabin. Private Price and Private Miller were there, already digging from their side. The reunion was brief but emotional. Now they had to reach the third cabin where the other mountain men were trapped. Helena Vogel, despite being one of the youngest, proved to have remarkable endurance. She worked tirelessly, her hands bleeding from the rough work. By the third day of their entombment, they had successfully connected all three cabins through tunnels dug in the snow. The avalanche had created a strange new world, buried but alive, where 36 people from 3 different nations lived in a forced intimacy that broke down barriers faster than any diplomatic treaty could have achieved. The storm continued above them, but within their snow-covered sanctuary, a different kind of thaw was occurring. It began when Ingrid Brenner pulled a packet of letters from inside her uniform jacket. They were worn, creased from being read countless times, some with water stains that might have been tears. She held them carefully, as if they were made of glass. "These are from my brother," she said quietly in German, then repeated in halting English for the Americans. "He was killed in North Africa 2 years ago. These are the last words I have from him." Anna, now recovered enough to sit up, reached into her own belongings and produced a similar bundle. "From my mother. She died in the bombing of Dresden. I received word 3 weeks before my capture." Her voice broke. "I never got to say goodbye." What followed was unexpected and profound. One by one, the women began sharing their letters, their photographs, their stories of loss. Liesel spoke of a fiancé who died in France. Helena showed a picture of her younger sisters, their current whereabouts unknown. Each story was a window into private grief that had been carried silently through months of captivity. Sergeant Bennett listened, and then quietly retrieved his own wallet. Inside was a photograph of a young woman holding a baby. "My wife and daughter," he said softly. "Haven't seen them in 18 months. My daughter was born while I was already overseas. I've never held her." Private Eugene Miller nodded, understanding in his eyes. He shared his own story of a brother killed at Normandy, of parents who had lost both their sons to the war, one dead and one an ocean away. The mountain men added their voices to this chorus of loss. Wilhelm spoke again of his son, this time sharing details he had kept private. How the boy had loved to climb trees, how he had dreamed of becoming a teacher, how his laugh had filled their small house with joy. Georg talked about his sister, her kindness, her talent for singing, how the village had felt darker after she was taken away. Josef, the eldest, shared the deepest history. His father had fought in the First World War, had returned broken and haunted. He told me that war turns men into monsters, and monsters into men. I didn't understand until now. Here we are, supposed enemies, and I see only people who have lost too much. Frida found herself crying openly, not just for her own losses but for all of it. The staggering, senseless weight of grief that had been distributed so widely, so indiscriminately. Franz sat across from her, and she saw tears on his weathered face as well. Their eyes met, and something fundamental shifted between them. On the 5th day, the wind finally stopped. The silence was so profound after days of constant howling that it woke several people from sleep. Josef was the first to notice, his mountain-trained senses alert to any change in conditions. He organized a team to dig upward, creating a vertical shaft through the snow that had buried them. When they finally broke through to open air, sunlight poured down the tunnel like a revelation. The landscape they emerged into was transformed beyond recognition. The storm had reshaped the entire valley, burying familiar landmarks under layers of snow that in some places stood higher than a man's head. The world was pristine, impossibly white, and utterly beautiful in the way that only survival makes beauty meaningful. One by one, the others climbed up to see the sun, their faces turned toward warmth they had feared they might never feel again, but the beauty came with harsh reality. They were still trapped, miles from any village, with limited supplies and no way to navigate through snow this deep. The trucks were completely buried, invisible beneath the white blanket. The only path forward was to wait for conditions to improve enough for travel, or for rescue teams to reach them. Joseph estimated at least another week, possibly 2. The extended time together created rhythms of daily life that began to feel almost normal. Meals were prepared communally, with the women learning mountain recipes from the Austrian men while teaching their own traditional dishes in return. Helena discovered she had a talent for baking bread in the cabin's ancient oven. Liesel and Private Miller continued their medical partnership, treating frostbite cases and minor injuries with a professional camaraderie that transcended their different backgrounds. Frida and Georg found themselves often working together, their initial wariness evolving into something approaching friendship. He taught her mountain skills, how to read weather signs in the sky, how to move efficiently through deep snow. She taught him English phrases, and they laughed together at his pronunciation struggles. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, touching on hopes and dreams that the war had interrupted. Franz remained more guarded, but even he softened as the days passed. He showed Anna how to carve wood, a skill passed down through generations of mountain families. She proved to have an artistic eye, creating small figurines that captured the character of birds and animals with surprising skill. When Franz complimented her work, it was the first kind word Anna had heard from him. Corporal Hayes organized English lessons in the evenings, with the German women eager to improve their language skills. The cabin filled with laughter as they struggled through idioms and pronunciation. Ingrid proved to be a natural linguist, helping translate and bridge communication gaps. These evening sessions became anticipated events, moments of lightness in circumstances that could have bred only darkness. Wilhelm began sharing mountain legends and folk tales, stories his grandmother had told him as a child. The women listened intently, transported briefly from their reality into worlds of magic and wonder that existed in these peaks long before nations and wars had divided them. On the 12th day, they heard the distant sound of bells. Rescue teams from the valley below had finally reached them, bringing supplies, additional men, and news from the outside world. The war in Europe was approaching its end. Germany was collapsing. The prisoners would be transported to proper facilities to await official repatriation procedures. Their time in the mountain sanctuary was over. The rescue party consisted of 20 men from the villages below, led by Father Heinrich Bauer, a priest who had known Joseph since childhood. He surveyed the scene with amazement, noting the cooperative atmosphere, the shared meals being prepared, the easy conversations between people who should have been enemies. "Joseph," he said quietly in German, "what happened here?" "We survived together," Joseph replied simply. "And in surviving, we learned what we should have known all along. That suffering recognizes no uniforms." He paused, looking at the women who were gathering their meager belongings. "Heinrich, some of these women have nowhere to go. Their families are dead, their cities destroyed. What awaits them in Germany is starvation and chaos." The priest nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken question in his friend's words. "You're asking if the villages would take them in?" It wasn't really a question. Father Bauer had seen the same thing Joseph had seen, the transformation that occurred when people were forced to see each other as human beings rather than as symbols. That evening, before the evacuation would begin at dawn, Joseph called everyone together in the main cabin. His announcement was unprecedented, delivered first in German, then translated by Frida into English for the American guards. "The villages below have suffered greatly from this war. We have lost our young men, our resources, our hope, but we have not lost our humanity." He paused, his weathered face serious. "Any woman here who has no family to return to, who faces only uncertainty in Germany, may request to remain. Our villages will sponsor you, give you work, give you a chance to rebuild your life." The silence that followed was profound. Sergeant Bennett started to object, citing regulations and procedures, but Corporal Hayes placed a hand on his arm. They both understood they were witnessing something that transcended military protocol. Frida stood first, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "My entire family died in the bombing of Hamburg. I have nothing to return to." She looked at Joseph, then at Jorg. "If your offer is genuine, I would like to stay." Anna rose next, supported by Liesel. "My home is gone. Everything I knew is destroyed. Here, in these mountains, I found something I never expected: forgiveness." She looked at Franz, who met her gaze and nodded slightly. "I would like to stay." One by one, 11 more women stood. Not all. Some still had families waiting, had homes to return to, had duties they felt they must fulfill. But 13 women, nearly half of those who had survived the journey, made the choice to remain. 25 years later, in B.E. the spring of 1970, a monument was unveiled in the village square below those mountains. It bore no military insignia, no national flags, just a simple inscription in German and English: "In the coldest winter, humanity survived." The ceremony drew people from across Austria, Germany, and even America, all gathered to commemorate something that had seemed impossible during those dark days of war. Frida Mayer stood beside her husband Georg, their 3 children clustered around them. Her German accent had softened over the decades but never fully disappeared. She had become a teacher in the village school, helping a new generation understand that enemies could become neighbors, that hatred was a choice rather than a destiny. Her hands, once soft from office work, now bore the calluses of mountain life, of gardens tended, and wood chopped, and a life built from nothing. Anna Adler stood nearby with Franz, who had indeed married the woman he once wanted to leave in the snow. She had never fully recovered from the damage that brutal winter had inflicted on her lungs, but she had lived a full life regardless. Her wood carvings had become locally famous, sold to tourists who visited the mountains. Each piece told a story of transformation, of beauty emerging from hardship. Wilhelm had passed away 2 years earlier, but Liesel, who had married him after completing her medical training, stood with their children. She had become the village doctor, her clinic a place where anyone received care regardless of their ability to pay or their nationality. She often said that those 12 days buried in snow had taught her more about medicine than any textbook ever could. Not all the stories had been simple or easy. Helena had struggled for years with guilt and trauma before finding peace, working with Father Bauer in refugee services. Ingrid had returned to Germany in 1952, feeling called to help rebuild her homeland, but she maintained correspondence with those who had stayed. Several marriages between the women and local men had faced opposition and prejudice, but they had persisted, proving through their daily lives that reconciliation was possible. Joseph and Rosa Steiner, both now in their 80s, sat in places of honor at the ceremony. Joseph spoke briefly, his voice still strong despite his age. "That winter tried to kill us all. It should have divided us further. Instead, it showed us that when you strip away everything except the need to survive, you discover that we are all simply human. We all feel cold the same way. We all need warmth, food, shelter, and kindness." Sergeant Bennett had returned for the ceremony, traveling from Iowa with his grown daughter. He stood with Corporal Hayes, both men now civilians, both carrying photographs of that winter that they had kept private for decades. They had never spoken publicly about what happened in those mountains, but they had never forgotten it either. The monument's dedication ceremony concluded with a meal shared by everyone present, former enemies, now neighbors and family, breaking bread together as the spring sun warmed the mountains that had nearly claimed them all.